Los Angeles, 1985. The city that symbolized sunshine, Hollywood dreams, and golden beaches had suddenly turned into a hunting ground for something far darker. People stopped leaving their windows open at night. Hardware stores ran out of locks. Families kept baseball bats and kitchen knives beside their beds. Entire neighborhoods lived in fear of a man they only knew by the name whispered on TV. The Night Stalker. He wasn't like other serial killers who targeted one type of victim. He didn't stalk only young women, nor did he hunt only the elderly. His cruelty was unpredictable, and that's what made him terrifying. Children, grandparents, couples, single women, it didn't matter. If Richard Ramirez decided to come through your window that night, nothing could protect you. Between 1984 and 1985, Ramirez was linked to at least 13 murders, 11 sexual assaults, and countless home invasions. But what made him infamous wasn't just the brutality of his crimes. It was the chaos. There was no pattern. Victims ranged from 6 to 83 years old. Som stabbed others, bludgeoned many, and left satanic symbols as his twisted signature. Police and the public didn't know who he would strike next or why. That uncertainty, that randomness, is what sent Los Angeles into a panic. But what made the story even more disturbing was the man himself. He wasn't the quiet, reclusive loner often associated with serial killers. Richard Ramirez appeared in courtrooms like a rock, star-long black hair, dark sunglasses, a smirk carved across his face. He flashed a pentagram drawn on his palm and shouted, "Hail Satan," in front of cameras. And the strangest part, some people loved him for it. Young women filled the courtroom, some sending him love letters, others swearing they were in love with him. In their eyes, he wasn't a monster. He was a dark celebrity, a rebel against society. For everyone else, though, Ramirez was proof that true evil can wear a smile and walk in broad daylight. To understand how Richard Ramirez became the Night Stalker, we need to peel back the layers of his life. From a childhood scarred by violence and neglect, to the nights he prowled Los Angeles, armed with knives, guns, and an obsession with Satan. His story is one of the most chilling in criminal history. This isn't just about a man who killed. This is about how fear itself spread like a virus across an entire city, about how one man made millions feel unsafe in their own homes. And as we dive into his past, you'll see how the seeds of cruelty, obsession, and darkness grew long before Los Angeles even knew his name. But before we step into the nightmare crimes of the Night Stalker, we must first look at the boy Richard once was, and the violent world that shaped him. Every monster has an origin story, and for Richard Ramirez, the seeds of the Night Stalker were planted long before he prowled the streets of Los Angeles. His childhood wasn't just troubled, it was a storm of violence, neglect, and twisted influences that warped him into the predator he would one day become. Richard Lava Munoz Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a former Mexican police officer turned laborer on the Santa Fe Railroad. On paper, Julian was a hard-working immigrant father trying to support his family. But behind closed doors, he was a violent, explosive man. His temper was infamous. He would lash out at his children with belts, fists, and anything within reach. To young Richard, his father wasn't a protector. He was the first figure of fear. At school, Richard didn't fare much better. He was small, quiet, and often the target of bullying. But what stood out the most was how he behaved in class. It was what he did after school. As a boy, Richard suffered multiple head injuries, one from a swing accident that knocked him unconscious, another from being hit in the head by a falling dresser. Doctors now believe those brain injuries may have contributed to the impulses, aggression, and seizures that followed him into adulthood. Combine that with the abuse at home, and you had a young boy whose brain and environment were being rewired for violence. But the darkest influence of all came from someone Richard admired deeply. His cousin, Miguel "Mike" Ramirez. Mike was a Vietnam veteran who returned home with more than just scars he brought back, Polaroids of the horrors he inflicted overseas. Richa, barely a teenager, would sit with Mike as he showed him pictures of women he claimed to have raped, tortured, and murdered during the war. Mike didn't just share stories, he celebrated them. To young Richard, This wasn't a warning. It was an initiation. Then came the defining moment. One day, during an argument, Mike pulled out a gun and shot his own wife in the face right in front of Richard. The boy who already lived in fear and fascination with violence had just witnessed murder up close, and no one came to correct that lesson. Instead, Richard grew even more detached from normal life. By the time he reached high school, Richard was experimenting with marijuana, LSD, and cocaine. Drugs became his escape, but also his doorway into darker obsessions. He began sneaking into cemeteries at night, sleeping on graves, and fantasizing about Satan and death. The boy who once feared his father Esbelt now found comfort in the imagery of demons and shadows. At home, there was no rescue. His mother worked in a boot factory, struggling to keep food on the table. His siblings were caught up in their own troubles. Richard drifted further into isolation, his imagination filled with nightmares he wanted to turn real. Teachers noticed his detachment, but in the 1970s, a troubled boy slipping through the cracks wasn't unusual. No one realized the danger that was forming. By the age of 17, Richard had already begun breaking into homes. He wasn't yet killing, but the thrill of entering someone else's private world, of stealing control, was intoxicating. It was his first taste of being a predator. And like so many killers before him, once he had a taste, he would never stop. Looking back, psychologists point to this period of his life as the crucial turning point. A violent father, a murderous cousin. As a role model, repeated brain trauma, drug abuse, and obsession with satanic factor alone might not create a killer. But together, they built the framework of Richard Ramirez, the boy who would become the Night Stalker. And soon, that framework would take shape in blood. Because Richard's fascination with violence wasn't going to stay in his imagination. His first real crime was just around the corner, and it would show the world the brutality he was truly capable of. By the late 1970s, Richard Ramirez wasn't just experimenting with drugs and petty theft anymore. He was sharpening the skills that would one day terrify an entire city. Burglary became his training ground. Creeping into darkened homes, slipping through windows, rifling through drawers, it gave him power. He wasn't just stealing objects. He was invading the sanctuaries of strangers, leaving them violated and unsafe in their own homes. For Ramirez, that thrill was intoxicating. But the line between burglary and something much darker was already blurring. His fantasies rooted in violence, sex, and Satan demanded more. And in 1984, he crossed the point of no return. On June 28, 1984, a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vinco was found murdered in her Los Angeles apartment. She had been stabbed repeatedly while she slept. Her throat was slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. Neighbors described her as kind, gentle, and quiet. No one could imagine why anyone would want to harm her. But the brutality of the crime shocked police. The attack was frenzied. Savages wasn't a simple burglary gone wrong. The killer hadn't just taken her life. He had desecrated it. For Ramirez, Jenny Vinco was his first true kill. She was elderly, vulnerable, and alone. She represented everything he could dominate, and the thrill it gave him would fuel his hunger for more. Fast forward to March 17, 1985. By this time, Ramirez had been breaking into homes almost nightly, escalating his violence, but that evening would mark his transition into the terrifying persona that would grip Los Angeles. 22-year-old Maria Hernandez was pulling into the garage of her condominium when she came face to face with Ramirez. He raised a gun and fired, the bullet striking her hand as she instinctively raised it to protect herself. In shock and pain, Maria managed to escape and hide. But Ramirez wasn't done. He entered the condo and found Maria's roommate, Dale Okazaki, in the kitchen. Dale had heard the commotion and ducked behind the counter. When she peeked up, Ramirez was waiting. He shot her in the forehead, killing her instantly. What Ramirez didn't know was that Maria had survived, and she would become the first living witness to come face to face with the Night Stalker. That same night, he struck again. Only an hour later, he pulled another woman, Celie Agnew, from a car and shot her dead. The randomness, the speed, the sheer recklessness had sent police into a frenzy. Most serial killers follow a pattern. Ted Bundy hunted young women who looked alike. John Wayne Gacy targeted teenage boys. But Richard Ramirez was different. His victims were men, women, children, elderly. Used guns, knives, bludgeons, whatever worked in the moment. This unpredictability made him more terrifying than most. How could police track a killer with no clear victim type, no consistent weapon, no obvious timeline? It felt like he was everywhere, striking anyone, at any time. The media quickly realized what was happening. Headlines screamed about a serial killer on the loose, and the name the Night Stalker was born. For the people of Los Angeles, he wasn't just a criminal. He was a phantom, slipping into homes and vanishing into the darkness, leaving behind bodies and terror. For Richard Ramirez, each crime wasn't just an act of violence. It was fuel for his ego, proof of his power, and a message to the city. I can reach you anywhere. And soon, that message would grow louder. Because Richard wasn't just killing, he was taunting. He wanted the world to know that the Night Stalker was watching, waiting, and ready to strike again. By 1985, the entire city of Los Angeles was in a state of panic. Families were locking doors, windows, even sleeping with lights on. The Night Stalker wasn't just a killer anymore. It was a phantom terror, striking at random, leaving messages of Satan, and slipping away before police could react. But his reign of terror finally ended on August 31st, 1985. When the unthinkable happened, the people of Los Angeles caught him. After his face was plastered across newspapers and TV screens, Ramirez strolled into a convenience store completely unaware that the city was hunting him. A group of locals recognized him instantly. When he tried to run, they chased him down, beating him in the street until police arrived. The crowd shouted, "That's him! That's the Night Stalker." For the first time, Richard Ramirez, the dark figure haunting the city's nights, was completely exposed under the blinding light of day. His arrest set the stage for one of the most infamous trials in American history. Courtrooms are supposed to be solemn places of justice. The trial of Richard Ramirez was closer to a rock concert. The moment he walked in, dressed in black, flashing that cold smile, the atmosphere shifted. He wasn't trying to look remorseful. He wasn't trying to look innocent. He was performing. When asked to enter a plea, Ramirez leaned into the microphone and said, "Hail Satan." It wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a stage. Then came one of the strangest twists of all. Despite the horrific crimes he committed, Ramirez gained an army of admirers, mostly young women who wrote him letters, sent him photos, and even packed the courtroom just to catch a glimpse of him. Some women claimed they were in love with him. Others defended him as misunderstood. And for Ramirez, who thrived on attention, it was like oxygen. He flirted with his fans, smirked at the cameras, and seemed to enjoy the chaos. This wasn't shame. This was ego. To him, he wasn't just a defendant. It was a star. But the trial wasn't just about theatrics. Prosecutors presented a staggering case. Ballistics matched Ramirez's gun to multiple crime scenes. Shoe prints from a rare pair of Avia sneakers tied him directly to several murders. Survivors who had come face to face with him pointed him out without hesitation. And perhaps most damning, his fingerprints were found at crime scenes, sealing the case beyond doubt. The sheer brutality of his crimes shocked the jury again and again. Elderly victims beaten and killed in their homes. Children kidnapped, assaulted, and discarded like objects. Satanic symbols scrawled as taunts to investigators. Each new detail painted Ramirez not as a misunderstood outsider, but as a predator who took pleasure in spreading fear. On September 20th, 1989, the jury delivered its decision. Richard Ramirez was guilty of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. When the judge handed down the death sentence, Ramirez responded with his trademark smirk. Looking into the cameras, he said, "Big deal. Death always comes with the territory. See you in Disneyland." It was chilling not just because of the words, but because of the calmness. No remorse, no regret, just arrogance. The trial of Richard Ramirez wasn't just about justice, it was about spectacle. It showed how a sadistic killer could manipulate the spotlight, how horror could blur into entertainment, and how a courtroom could turn into a stage for ego. Even on death row, Ramirez continued to receive fan mail and marriage proposals. To some, he was a monster. To others, disturbingly, he was a celebrity. and that contradiction, the mix of terror and fascination, would follow him for the rest of his life. When Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death in 1989, most people assumed the story was over. A monster was locked away. Justice had been served. But what makes Ramirez unforgettable isn't just the horror of his crimes, as the shadow he left behind, one that still lingers decades later. Ramirez didn't kill for money. He didn't kill for survival. He killed for thrill, for domination, for power. Unlike other serial killers who followed patterns, his unpredictability made him even more terrifying. One night, he'd kill an elderly couple. The next, he'd abduct a child. He left satanic symbols at some scenes, but skipped them at others. He broke every mold criminologists tried to put him in. That chaos, that refusal to be understood, is part of why his case fascinates even now. He wasn't just a killer, he was an agent of fear itself. After his conviction, Ramirez became a symbol of the dark side of fame. His face, gaunt and pale, with that chilling stare, appeared on front pages worldwide. And then came the disturbing part, the fan clubs. Women sent him love letters. Some even offered to marry him. In 1996, a freelance magazine editor named Doreen Leoy did just as. She married him while he sat on death row. For some, this was proof of how far charisma and danger could warp human attraction. For others, it was a terrifying reminder. Evil eye sent, de just für. Sometimes, it's adored. Ramirez spent decades on death row in San Quentin prison, still making headlines occasionally for his defiant words and eerie behavior. But death didn't come by execution. Instead, in 2013, Richard Ramirez died at 53 years old of cancer. After years of appealing, smirking, and waiting, his life ended not in a gas chamber, but in a hospital bed. Some said it was unfair that he escaped the justice of execution. Others argued it was fitting. Death came quietly, with no stage, no cameras, no performance. Criminologists study Ramirez not only for his brutality, but for what he represented. The unpredictable predator. He wasn't targeting one type of victim. He wasn't confined to one area. His methods shifted constantly, making him nearly impossible to profile. He also exposed something darker: our cultural fascination with killers. Why did people send him fan mail? Why did crowds cheer just to glimpse him in court? Why did news outlets treat his smirk like a headline? The truth is unsettling. Society wasn't just terrified of Ramirez. In some twisted way, it was entertained by him. Even today, the name Night Stalker still sends a shiver down spines. Documentaries, podcasts, Netflix series, all revisit the story, trying to answer the same question. How could an ordinary man, born in Texas, raised in California, become this? There's no single answer. Abusive childhood, drug addiction, exposure to violence, satanic obsession. Maybe it was all of it, or maybe Richard Ramirez was simply born with darkness no one could fix. Richard Ramirez died years ago, but the fear he spread lives on. His story isn't just about murder, about the thin line between everyday life and unthinkable horror. Because while we like to believe monsters hide in shadows, Ramirez proved something far scarier. Sometimes, the monster knocks on your door in the middle of the night. If this story made you rethink what it means to feel safe, subscribe for more chilling cases of killers who hide in plain sight. The Night Stalker is gone, but his legacy is a warning that evil doesn't always look like a stranger in the dark. Sometimes, it smiles right at you.